name is Frank Gerrits. I am one of the core members of the decolonization group at Utrecht University, a group that tries to think a little bit more deeply about what decolonization can mean in an academic setting. We've been working for 2 years now, I think, 2 years, 3 years now, and it's been very challenging with the pandemic, but we've done some very interesting events with workshops, but also conversations with students and engagement with people from a sort of broader societal network. And what we are trying to do is also set up a lecture series, of which this is the second year, the second installment, called the Unsettling Knowledge Seminar Series, in which we try to unsettle and maybe even decolonize a little bit different academic disciplines and different types of research. And in that context, I'm very, very happy to welcome Rosalba Icaza, who's a professor in global politics, feminism, and decoloniality at the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, trained at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico, but then also obtained a master's degree and a PhD at Warwick. She was a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow, very challenging to obtain that grant, so congrats, between 2005 2007. And she became a senior lecturer in governance and international political economy at the Institute of Social Studies in 2007, where she is now a professor in global politics, as I mentioned. Rosalba has published widely, broadly, and I would encourage you to consult her publication list online. Most recently, the most recent publication I could find, which is also the reason why I got a little bit lost in the CV, is her publication on Mexico, Coloniality of Power and the Developmentalist State in Mexico, which is a very interesting online publication that you can consult online, and I will put in the chat immediately. Those who have the application can then find it there immediately. Her work is, I think, characterized by commitments to thinking deeply about feminism, decoloniality, and global politics, and what that all might mean in very concrete and interesting case studies, which is something that I find very attractive and intriguing, because it sort of takes away our discussions about decolonization from sometimes an aspect of this or an area that we find a little bit too abstract, and really takes it into something that we can think about and work with, which I find incredibly intriguing. So, Rosalba, if you are ready, I'm very happy that you were willing to speak here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, that piece was something interesting. For a long time, I avoid to speak about the Mexican state, but it's unavoidable given the invisibility of a plurality of nations and horizons of possibilities, that I have to respond with a piece like that, especially to criticize the current leftist government in power. So if you're interested, you can read a little bit of how I'm understanding how the so-called developmentalist state is actually in Mexico reproducing coloniality. So that's the last piece that I wrote. But anyway, Frank, thank you for creating the conditions for having me today. I'm very happy. I don't know if there are students in the room that you mentioned. I hope that they are able to listen properly and see me properly. Please
Rachel
feel
is
free.
working on it.
Okay, good.
But it will happen.
Good. So I hope that the rest of you feel safe enough at some point to open your cameras. It will be very meaningful for me to see your faces. But of course, if it's not safe or you don't feel comfortable, you are free also to keep your cameras off. As long as we feel comfortable to see each other's eyes, that will be something comfortable for me as well. So thank you everybody for being here, and I'm going to start by doing what we have been already doing all these months and years, and is sharing my screen. I work on a presentation and some images that I want you to share with you today, and through which I normally think through when I speak about the field of development studies. Um, so my opening question, or what I will be trying to address today, is in relation to the name of the seminar series, is can we unsettle development? And if we can do that, so what for? What are we actually trying to do this kind of work? So let me start. In the text, Dance, Pain, and Collective Memory, the artist and activist Paulina Trejo reflects on the international meeting of women whose struggle organized by Zapatista women in Chiapas in the south of Mexico in December 2019. Paulina Trejo shared the following, and I open quotes. On the last day in the morning, a choreography and a performance was organized in which many of us participated. We created a circle, and inside the first circle was another one forming a spiral snail. Someone at the microphone shared some words about the dehumanization that we face as girls for the simple fact of being girls. The performance was to honor the memory of the disappeared and murdered girls and women. At the rhythm of the drums, we began the choreography moving slowly, together. At some point, we jumped, screamed, hitting the ground, then fired away, simulating to be dead women. The person who was at the microphone shared some words about the violence we experienced. In the end, she mentioned that we are still in resistance, and we all raised our fist up. There were tears running down my compañera's cheek. I cried too. We hugged. They didn't know me. I didn't know them. We hugged each other while we cried non-stop. Before letting her go, I told her, I do believe you. You are not alone. There are experiences of violence that we share and that transform everything inside us. To be able to listen to the mothers of women who were victims of feminicide, or who after being silent for years revealed to have been raped, hurts. There is a pain that we share, a wound that does not close, because the violence has never stopped. End of quote. In this presentation, points of departure matter. In Undoing Colonial Patriarchies, Life Struggle Pathways, Mexican anthropologists such as Leiva tell us the following. The starting points that we select have a strong imprint that is not only symbolic, but also concrete and practical, on what we do, think, and feel, and above all, in how we do, think, and feel it. The starting points intersect with the place of enunciation, but cannot be reduced to it. Since 2008, I have collaborated with a group of indigenous and mestizo academics activists based in the so-called Global South and in the Global North, who have been conducting collaborative research, writing, and teaching practices on the knowledges that are co-created by communities resisting violent forms of power, destroying land, women's life, and hope in Avia the Americas. We have documented and disseminated our findings in books and academic publications via itinerant schools and with the creation of an autonomous, non-commercial publishing house, Editorial Retos. But most importantly, we have been reflecting together about the learnings that emerge from defending rivers, mountains, land, and our intimate relations with Earth. We are called the Transnational Network Other Knowledges, Red Transnacional Otros Saberes. For some of us who are based in Armenia in the Global North, to learn and teach about our relation to Earth as one primarily implicated in its consumption and destruction has meant to unlearn who we are. All the ideas you are going to listen today emerge from these processes of unlearning. In Retos, for example, we approach the field of development studies from a positionality marked by both the invisibility as Black, Indigenous, people of color of our scientific contributions to the field and academia in general, but also our hypervisibility. We have reflected on how the misrepresentation and appropriation of Black, Indigenous, trans, queer people of color, and flesh experiences have been essential for establishing a development studies canon, and how concurrently that canon has been essential to reproduce that misrepresentation and appropriation. We understand that the field of development studies is unsafe for dialogue and has failed miserably to be accountable to the majorities of the world. We encounter development as what articulates the modern colonial divide. In other words, development functions to articulate the separation between those who consume the lives of others and of Earth and those who are consumed. Today, I will explain this perspective as one that is decolonial and feminist. This intervention is situated in the inquiry and praxis of decolonial thinking that gravitates around the notion of modernity as coloniality, or modernity/coloniality/decoloniality. The first slash indicates that there are no modern epistemologies, institutions, norms, and subjectivities without coloniality, and the latter is not just as a derivative, but co-constitutive of the former. The second slash, between modernity and coloniality, indicates there is something beyond modernity, because there are ways of relating to the world, ways of feeling, acting, sensing, thinking, ways of living and inhabiting the world that come from other genealogies, non-Western and non-modern. But here non-modern denotes that these are not pre-modern or reduced, but that these are reduced, as such, by the modern apparatus in which, in this way, are logically constituted to be at odds with a dichotomous, hierarchical, categorical logic of Western modern thinking and critique. My entry point is to unsettle modern epistemologies that inform the we in the opening question of this contribution today, of this seminar. Can we unsettle development studies? And if so, what for? I'm conscious that in the field of development studies, there has been recent attempts to unsettle, decenter, dominant forms of knowledge and knowing about development and what is there to be developed. These, of course, are efforts welcome but insufficient if the inclusivity of more voices and perspectives from beyond the Anglo-North European sphere leave intact the terms of the conversation to where that plurality is being invited. My take on that we is more than opening the door while holding the lock. It's not about seeking to decenter or to unsettle an ongoing conversation on development studies. My take is a different one, informed by the colonial calls for onto-epistemic disobedience. From my point of view, but also from the point of view of many others, that we is one that is mobilized in a way that reinforces imperial difference and actively produces as non-existent and unintelligible those who dwell in its borders, the less than human and the more than human, and those positioned in between across the colonial difference. This is presented as a central technique of power, characteristic of universalisms, precisely by the colonial feminisms. Having its origin in Latin America, as many of you know, decoloniality enters the social sciences as a field of critical inquiry concerned with modern and colonial structures of power, knowledge, gender, and subject formation, and proposes a turn to an epistemic or cognitive South in the reconstitution of global political societies. Essentially, the notion of an epistemic South denotes the existence of multiple epistemes, or ways of knowing, with the North American and North Atlantic or Western modern just being one of them. I encountered decoloniality while doing research within the field of global governance within an institution focused on development studies such as the ISS. The field of global governance studies in that moment was concerned, and to the best of my knowledge to this day, continue to be concerned with explaining and interpreting the phenomena of governing across different scales and arenas of power and authority. And when intersected with the interdisciplinary field of development studies, its focus turns to the so-called Global South countries. The introduction of the notion of governance in development studies inaugurated a vast production of analysis concerned with formal, informal, decentralized, polycentric, and networked forms of power, control, and authority in post-colonial states and markets. Today, we can find a vast amount of scholarship informed by many theoretical perspectives interpreting shifts, crises, and continuities in the governance of development in post-colonial societies. Meanwhile, analysis informed by post-structuralism and post-positivist understandings of power and politics generated analysis of underdevelopment as a form of governmentality that unfolds through networked forms of self-control and management. Other critical development studies perspectives, including post-colonial and post-development scholarship, inspired by critical and deconstructive social theory, contributed with interpretations on the violent impositions, peaceful acquiescence, negotiations, adaptations, and mimicry of modern governance institutions and norms in colonial, post-colonial, settler, and non-settler contexts. In contrast, the modernity coloniality approach, by focusing on the coloniality of power, the coloniality of governance, and the coloniality of development, is characteristically distinct from all these established approaches. More specifically, decolonial scholarship, like post-colonial and post-development approaches, is concerned with how governing unfolds through the imposition of development as a universalized narrative and product of civilization. Paraphrasing Walter Mignolo, development from a decolonial perspective denotes a local history that governs as a global design. But as decolonial scholars, we do something else. Our task is to articulate the erasures, destruction, destitution, silencing that entail the operation of governing. Our task is to try to understand what is no more, or more precisely, what is produced as a no more. Please do not confuse that no more as what in a modern colonial chronological and contemporary understanding of time is named as past. That no more inhabit multiple and entangled realities in plural temporalities. That is what First Nation scholar Nick Estes' book on the Standing Rock Resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, entitled Our History is the Future, and the Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Indigenous Anti-Futurist Manifesto, articulates as, and I open quote, "Dear colonizer, your future is over." End of quote. But how can one do research of what is no more? And more importantly, why and what for? To further explain the centrality of the notion of coloniality as erasure and as a constitutive of Western modernity, as what a decolonial approach to knowing and knowledge is concerned with, I will share with you the experience of the counterplantation system as developed by Haitian sociologist Jean Casimir. More than often, the Haitian Revolution of 1791 and the processes that led into the establishment of the first modern republic that resulted from a slave-led rebellion are simply erased from canonical texts on governance in development studies. But when Haiti is included, this nation is overrepresented as the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, a place of destitution, disaster, chaos, a failed state, a case study holding important governance lessons for international aid practitioners and other countries of the so-called Global South. Dubois and Jensen, co-editors of the Haiti Humanities Laboratory at Duke University, noted in 2012 that, and I open quote, for most of the 19th century, Haiti was a site of agricultural innovation, productivity, and economic success. So I close the direct quote. So I asked, what went wrong? What other developing countries can learn from this? Advancing answers to these sort of questions will be a relevant task within the fields of governance and development. In contrast, the colonial scholarship is concerned about something else. For Haitian sociologist Jan Casimir, the focus should be on learning from the reconstitution of a sovereign society led by individuals from African descent brought to the Caribbean as slaves that rejected French colonial order. Nonetheless, Haiti's experiences are erased or actively reduced to be a case of failure. Indeed, from a decolonial angle, what matters is to ask how this reduction to failure is connected to colonialism, imperialism, race and racialization in development and governance studies. Indeed, through research that prioritizes the approach of historical entanglements instead of local exceptionalisms or regional comparisons, scholars have demonstrated the connections between colonialism and slavery, the expansion of the international sugar market, and a particular form of governance, the plantation, that extracted the life of the enslaved and of earth for the enjoyment of a sweetened tea in the imperial metropoles since the 16th century. But the colonial scholarship, by focusing on the coloniality of those historical entanglements, in other words, of what lies under these entanglements, have provided an additional set of interesting lessons. As carefully researched from a Latin American critical historical sociological perspective and methodology that foregrounds the experiential knowledge of those historically oppressed, Casimir traces down in Haiti how the disenfranchised African-descended rural peasantry, Mount and Dejo, sustained a counter-plantation system as a site of resistance, running along the grain of colonial institutions in the form of small plots of land inhabited by generations of extended families. Furthermore, these families counted with their own conceptualizations and perspectives of themselves and the world, some of which subsist to this day. This counter-governance system, nonetheless, has been constantly erased and disregarded by traditional and contemporary Haitian historiography, and by more recent diagnosis on Haiti's current governance and development challenges. The problem with this erasure and disregard is that important lessons about life sustainability, autonomy and self-reliance under colonial violence and slavery then, and under conditions of global climate change today, are muted. Social experience on life-affirming practices is produced as non-existent. To find ways to de-silence these experiences, to transform contemporary disciplinary frameworks and methodologies, common understandings of the world, and who we are as world society have been key concerns of decolonial scholarship. In the rest of my presentation, I will offer elements of a decolonial disengagement with academic research informed by my experiences as decolonial feminist in the field of governance and development. In so doing, I foreground Latin America and First Nations indigenous perspectives, Afro-Caribbean and South African and anti-colonial genealogies that have inspired contemporary analysis on coloniality and a specific orientation in knowledge cultivation. Decoloniality, as probably many of you know, has been defined as a liberatory praxis that emerged from First Nation communities and Afro-descendant peoples in Aviala, the Americas, and their struggles for political autonomy and land restitution. Decoloniality has also been defined as an onto-epistemic option, that in other words means an option for ways of being and knowing, and that within academia orients an ethics in knowledge cultivation. While for some others decoloniality is a political imperative of transformation towards decolonization, Marina Tlostanova argues about the relevance of decoloniality as an option, as it is, and I open quote, consciously chosen as a political, ethical, and epistemic positionality and an entry point into agency. I close the quote. Belonging to a different geogenealogy to that of post-colonial studies, decoloniality enters academic debates with a perspective on modernity as coloniality, articulated in its basic proposition as follows: there is no modernity without coloniality. Coloniality, understood as an underside of modernity, constitutes a geo-historical and epistemic location from which reality is thought and sensed. But modernity as coloniality also challenges the dominant version of history that places the British Empire, or sometimes French, at its center. Modernity from a decolonial perspective is understood as 3 centuries older, and its study displaced from the 19th century to the 15th-16th century, when the conquest of the Americas in 1492 and the control of the Atlantic took place. From this vantage point, Western modernity is not understood as a product of the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution, but as 3 centuries older, to emphasize the moment in which Europe, as a civilizational project, claimed universality for itself, producing all other cultures as particular, other, subaltern, backward, etc. Coloniality is also a short way to speak about the matriz moderna colonial de poder, modern colonial matrix of power, a term coined by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano in the late 90s. For Quijano, this matrix operated as a structure of management by controlling the economy, authority, knowledge, and subjectivities. More recently, modernity coloniality have been conceptualized as 2 different geo-historical movements or forms of relationship with what is real. In this way, modernity is seen as a historical movement of power, naming and representing reality. It is a movement of appropriating words of meaning. For example, non-Europeans were named Indians, uncivilized, non-humans in the colonial encounter, and more recently, a group of countries are named underdeveloped or lacking development as they do not conform to the modern norm. Meanwhile, coloniality is the geo-historical movement in which the erasure of knowing systems outside or in the margins of what is deemed as human rationality takes place. What's more, the counter-plantation system in the experience of Haiti can be mentioned here to illustrate coloniality as erasure. Through the work of Gurminder Bambra, Manuela Boat Gansabelo, and Dolobu, it is possible to grasp decoloniality's world system theory, dependency, and underdevelopment theories lineage that to this day shape its disengagements with the field of development studies. Interestingly, decoloniality entered English-speaking debates on development studies via post-development scholarship in the work of Arturo Escobar, who in the article Worlds and Knowledges Otherwise, the Latin American Modern Decoloniality Research Program, introduced the notion of modernity as coloniality or modernity as co-constituted by coloniality. In the early 2000s, this perspective of modernity as coloniality was at odds with other debates in the field of critical development studies that were immersed in deliberations around the impact of globalization, and hybrid forms of development, post-socialist regimes' economic transitions, and the reassertion of neoliberal intellectual agendas on poverty focalization, governance decentralization, and participatory approaches to development. In Worlds and Knowledges Otherwise, Escobar's perspective of modernity, not as a totality, but as a totalizing project, is contrasted with two highly influential scholars, US political scientist Francis Fukuyama and British sociologist Anthony Giddens. At the end of the 90s, Fukuyama had coined the idea of the end of history to mark the victory of liberal democracy and market economics, while Giddens argued that globalization was the radicalization and totalization of modernity. Escobar contested these ideas, and in particular, that there was no escape or possibility of an outside of modernity in the following way, and I open direct quote. The question of whether there is an exteriority to the modern colonial world system is easily misunderstood. In no way should this exteriority be thought about as a pure outside, untouched by the modern. I close the quote, the direct quote. Let me share another one. I know it's a long one, but I think that it's important that I bring Arturo Escobar here with me today. Escobar introduces the question of Eurocentrism, colonial difference, and border thinking as three important elements of the colonial thinking that today delineates its disengagement with the field of development studies. And this is the quote that I wanted to read to you. This, the exteriority to modern colonial world system, is precisely what most European and Euro-American theorists seem unwilling to consider. That it is impossible to think about transcending or overcoming modernity without approaching it from the perspective of the colonial difference. The various Eurocentric critiques of Eurocentrism, in short, these continue to be thought about from within Eurocentric categories of, say, liberalism, Marxism, post-structuralism, not from the border thinking enabled by the colonial difference. Critiques of modernity, in short, are blind to the epistemic and cultural colonial difference that becomes the focus of modernity coloniality. End of quote. Escobar's contestation of modernity as a totality of what is real or possible challenges Eurocentrism, but also distinguishes the colonial thinking from other critical perspectives exploring modern development. This is the case, for example, of postcolonial scholarship in development studies. Postcolonial approaches in development studies have firmly inspired by and in tension with Western philosophical genealogies thinking the post-colonial material, socioeconomic, and cultural condition, and in so doing have expanded interpretations on modern development to notions such as negotiation, hybridity, multiplicity, subalterity, and cultural geographies. In contrast, decolonial scholarship acknowledgement of an exteriority to modernity denotes ways of being, knowing, sensing, and worlding the world that are no modern and no Western. However, these are reduced to be non-modern, named difference, the other, by modern colonial logics, frameworks of understandings, and rationalities. At this point of my argument, First Nations' notion of human beings as belonging to Earth and the counter-plantation system in Haiti are both, once more, relevant experiences that can illustrate what existed and exists at the exteriority or at the borders of the modern colonial logics and rationalities of extraction of life, of the enslaved, and of Earth. In short, they shed light on the exteriority of modernity coloniality and help us to mark what lies beyond the interpretative analytic of development. Furthermore, given that colonial difference, as argued by Escobar, enables border thinking, this has been undertaken by decolonial scholarship as an epistemology, an embodied consciousness following the work of Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa. Border thinking as a gnosis, a way of knowing enabled by colonial difference, also marks the limits of Eurocentric epistemologies. characteristically disembodied and anthropocentric when confronted with the task of knowing sensing, sentir pensar, what is to belong to Earth and the counter-plantation system. Recently, there have been important efforts to question the politics of knowledge that constantly emphasize tensions instead of overlaps and dialogues across the difference between postcolonial and decolonial thinking. And this is certainly a relevant task and informs recent conceptualizations of development from a decolonial angle that, although recognize contributions and overlaps, does not collapse specificities, differences, and productive tensions. In so doing, development has been conceptualized as, mentioned at the beginning, representation and articulation of colonial difference, or in other words, of the division between the human and the savage, between civilization and nature. Development functions articulating the separation between the consumer and the lives of the people and Earth that are being incorporated, dispossessed, extracted, and consumed. The loss of plurality of worlds of meaning and forms of life is the coloniality of development. In short, my argument is that development works as a mediation towards those who consume and those who are consumed. From this perspective, development comes to mean the loss of worlds of meaning or worldlessness, the loss of the relation with Earth, earthlessness, and the loss of the capacity of a contextual and enfleshed knowing, enfleshlessness. These losses are called the coloniality of development. And in so doing, they aim to counter ideas of progress, growth, frugal innovation, betterment, positive change, and so on. We name this loss, again, the coloniality of development. To close this part of the presentation, it becomes relevant to mention that as decoloniality entered development studies via Arturo Escobar, one of the most renowned post-development scholars, these two approaches have often been conflated or assumed to be addressing the same concerns in almost similar ways. However, this is far from being the case. Post-development approaches certainly pave the way for a decolonial disengagement with development, but there is a constant, although productive tension between these two. The title of a recent compilation by Bendix, Muller, and CI, Beyond the Master Tools, Decolonizing Knowledge, Orders, Research, Methods, and Teaching, can help me to illustrate this tension as follows. Whereas post-development scholarship is still questioning the feasibility of going beyond the master tool with a question mark, decolonial scholarship has never lived full-time in the master's house, and as expressed by Suleika Sheikh, refuses his tools as these are implicated in the dehumanization of the other. The master house and his tools, from a decolonial perspective, are actively implicated in the consumption of the life of others and of Earth. In a nutshell, to the post-development critique, the decolonial option responds with onto-epistemic delinking, autonomia, disobedience, as a precondition for plural liberations. To illustrate this point further, I will focus on the notion of coloniality of gender. Argentinian philosopher and popular educator, Maestra María Lugones, coined the term coloniality of gender to analyze racialized capitalist gender oppression when researching why people was so indifferent to the violence against Black women and women of color. In her thinking, she wondered in which ways colonization and the dehumanization of indigenous and Black bodies were part of the explanation in this contemporary phenomena. In so doing, Lugones introduced the notion of coloniality of gender to theorize class and race, but also gender as social categories imposed in the colonial encounter through different technologies of dehumanization and genocide, such as systematic rape of colonized women. In consequence, these categories, gender, race, are seen as acting as universalisms, and as such erase and silence the feminicide, racialized othered. The notion of coloniality of gender of Maria Lugones extends an exploration of gender as a socialized sexual difference anchored to the history of colonialism. In this sense, Lugones thinks of gender as a mechanism of colonial domination over non-Western racialized bodies. And it is in this sense that Lugones help us to understand the historical moment in which this specific system becomes a form of subjugation, in a concrete mechanism of transformation and government of all life forms through control of the bodies and subjectivities of the people who have been colonized. In the middle of the silence and erasure of coloniality of gender, the colonial feminists are asking the following questions. What plurality of forms of sociability that did not have as a deep root a dimorphic representation of male-female, opposites of bodies, sexualities, and spiritualities were buried under the categories patriarchy, gender, women, men? If patriarchy, gender, women are not universal or common to all cultures, if these did not exist before, how do we show their analytical and theoretical limits without denying their current concrete existence and violence? Let's bring here an illustration of post-development and decolonial feminist scholarship, contrasting contributions to the field of development. As it is well known, feminist post-development scholarship inspired by anti-essentialist critical, deconstructive, and social theory has contributed to the unsettling of gender binaries in development interventions, for example, on sexual and reproductive health. This scholarship has contributed with a perspective of power in of development institutions and norms as open-ended, hence not natural, but historically situated in modernity and even in British Victorian sexual norms. Contrastingly, decolonial feminisms have contributed to unveil forms of social organization, of sociability, on the basis of fluid sexual dualities as already existing 500 years before the term of sexual fluidity entered feminist anti-essentialist lingo. So, where do we start to tell the story of non-binary sexualities in development studies, and what for? In many feminisms, gender, sometimes intersect with class, is a given point of departure, and this is precisely a stark difference with decolonial feminism, for whom gender is not a point of departure, but coloniality. Lugones' concept of coloniality of gender allows us to understand the historical movement towards the imposition of a Western, modern, global, Eurocentric capitalist heterosexual order that today is still in place. This is why the task of decolonial feminism is distinct and independent from established anti-essentialist critical feminist theories influenced by post-structuralism, post-humanism, and neo-materialism today. Decolonial feminism's priority is not the analysis of the imposition or dominant representations of subalternity, but that of exploring reciprocal and collaborative ways of de-silencing, ways of being, knowing, sensing, made absent by the heterosexual colonial modern gender system. In his reading of Lugones, Sabelo Endolovu notes the following. Lugones posits, and I open quote, that it is necessary to understand differential gender arrangements along racial lines, so as to highlight the two sides of the modern colonial gender system. The light side represents oppression along the lines of gender privileging white bourgeois men over their white bourgeois women, but without reducing them to the status of non-beings. The underside or darkest side represents dehumanization and animalization to to the extent that the colonized men and women are subjects not of genderization, but of mere crude sexualization into female and male non-beings. End of quote, sorry. Recent feminist decolonial scholarship foregrounds the silence of coloniality and the erasure of the feminicide othereth, which includes the racialized majorities of the world, but also of Earth and Earth beings, reduced to be nature, and as such a resource that can be owned. Accordingly, decolonial feminists offer interpretations of contemporary governance of development as a violent operation. In that operation, the majorities of the world are reduced to subalternity, the plurality of their life-affirming projects and worldviews are reduced to mean underdevelopment, and Earth and Earth beings are reduced to mean environment or resources. From this perspective, decolonial feminists do research on what is no more, which is not a simple task as you can imagine. Furthermore, as decolonial feminists, we are interested in finding ways of unearthing or de-silencing what has been previously produced as non-existent or non-intelligible by methodologies that are epistemically violent. Our interest, as articulated by Suleika Sheikh, is to develop approaches to knowledge and knowing that are not complicit with our own dehumanization. To conclude my presentation, I will go back to the question open in this seminar. Can we unsettle development studies, and if so, what? Given the parameters of possibility granted to us by the question of unsettling, I see that our task as decolonial feminists is naming, first of all, an outside of the epistemic totalizing movement of development. As a concept, as an analytic, I invite for a position understanding of its explanatory possibilities. Not only you today, but constantly, this is what I do in my own classroom at ISS. A position understanding means that it is localized within the epistemic territory of modernity and modern selfhood and subjectivity, where it is articulated as a response to operations of power, domination, control, and so on. It reveals its own geo and body political location from its coloniality. So, to be clear, this response is not about representing a decolonial proposal on development studies, nor does it claim the possibility of decolonizing as a synonym of unsettling development. I'm trying to embrace a productive tension that emerged from the task of undoing the coloniality of development studies as a field and delinking from its governance. To undertake coloniality as an onto-epistemological point of departure, while accepting the task of undoing its manifestations in the field of development studies as a woman of color working in European academia, is nonetheless a highly problematic task. It requires from people like me to undo silencing and dehumanization with conceptual tools and means of academic validation, such as expert use of theories in colonial languages and writing styles that are complicit precisely with our own silencing and dehumanization. So, there seems to be, so far, no way out without pain, without reactivation of trauma, and without sensing the colonial wound. This carries a huge ethical responsibility for us as researchers, teachers, and mentors within academic institutions that deny our full humanity and wholeness. If our aim is to illustrate how to conduct a feminist decolonial critique of development studies to radicalize knowledge praxis, we can only hope to find solace in learning each other as women of color, as Jackie Alexander has invited us, but also in inviting others to encounter each other as this intervention aims to do by naming the logics and disembodied rationalities that are trying to constantly enclose our imaginations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was great. I have a few questions. There are also a few questions in the chat. You can put questions in the chat, yes, if you would want to. I don't know if Rachel is.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm also happy to jump in with Frank on moderating. So I'm sitting in this very, very big room. We had hoped to do this in person, and we were have some students along. So I have an imagined audience who is in rapturous applause right now online. Thank you so much, Rosalba. That was wonderful. Hi, and I was just tweeting, so I hope you're okay with me tweeting in admiration the theoretical walkthrough that you just took us through, and also of the sort of positioned way in which you did it, and the positioning at the end, which I know is something we've discussed in other circumstances before, and that I greatly appreciate. So thank you for that. I do have a couple of questions, but I also want to privilege the questions in the room. I actually had, but I'll kick off while people gather their thoughts. I had a very basic question, so I'm a little embarrassed to ask it, but I found the pictures on your slides so evocative and so wonderful, and one in particular, the image of the two women with their hair curled and entwined, and I don't think you specifically mentioned it when you were discussing it, but it seemed so evocative. And
This
yes,
one.
yeah, and I wondered how you had chosen it to express modernity as coloniality, and if you could talk us through that a little bit.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. First of all, I should say that the kind of exercise that I do in showing these sort of images is after I really took seriously the question of the violence of representation, not only in development studies that keeps reproducing the narratives of pain and destitution as an everyday business, and thinking my way out, not necessarily a radical or a completely out of this violence of representation. I started to practice a little bit of photography myself. I'm not a professional photographer, but I started to try to think how could I start talking about something that is so painful as coloniality for many people that I was teaching in the context of ISS, who happens to be many students coming from the so-called Global South, in a way that didn't reproduce these narratives of pain and destitution that are so constitutive of development studies. And in doing this, I started to reach out to other photographers, to artists, and some of the images that you saw, not this one particularly, and I can speak a little bit more about the other ones, but let me just focus on this one, are artists that are located physically, geographically, in the south of my own country in Mexico, in Oaxaca, in the south of Mexico, and in Chiapas, where I go mostly every year to not necessarily do research or conduct research or terribly called fieldwork, but actually to think together, act together, do milpa together, and in this way on doing my own modern mestiza, white mestiza subjectivity. And this image comes from one of the central streets in Oaxaca, and Oaxaca is one universe in itself. It's the largest state in the south of Mexico that has the largest number of indigenous First nations there, and it's a particularly let's say aesthetically really beautifully aesthetically productive city that in 2006 expelled all the authorities. It has a long tradition of autonomy, of getting rid of state institutions. So there is a lot of graffiti on the streets. And this graffiti is actually in one of the main avenues where women play a very important role in the first commune that emerged, contemporary commune that emerged in the city in 2006. And I love it when I saw it, because if you see, on one hand, you have the typical modern, French modern aspirations of libertad, equity, freedom, equality, and then on the other side you have respeto, to be respect. And I always use this image, which is anonymous. I don't know who actually did it. Apparently the graffiti artist is Mega, but I never managed to meet this person. But I love it because it allows me to see how co-constituted our aspirations as modern selves is entangled with our modern subjecthood, and all the constitution also of a feminist subjectivity, because this comes obviously from, let's say, a feminist artist. Later on I heard, although I don't know this person, but this is what you saw there, and that's what I use it, and it's powerful, I think so.
Yeah, especially the words in the hair, and that sort of incredibly organic and yet stylized kind of aesthetic. I find it wonderful. Does anybody have a question? Do go ahead and unmute yourself. Or also feel free. There were a number of thinkers there, and so feel free, Rosalba, to speak.
Yeah, there is a very interesting comment, Rachel, in the chat. Yes, well, yes, of course. Many of the ideas that I'm sharing here are thought with Rolando. Perhaps I should have said the ideas that I'm presenting about the coloniality of development is part of an article that we co-authored that is called, I think that is a tool. No, it's called the Decolonizing Development, a decolonial approach or something like that. Now I cannot remember. So really, I'm very familiarized with his thinking. And this is a long-term endeavor. Finding ways of speaking about the coloniality of development within the universities, the kind of project that I have been working, and in his case is how to speak and refer about the violence of coloniality in the context of the museum. And somehow these two are complementary and touched very much in different ways. So sorry if I didn't bring Rolando. There is also a personal situation why I never mentioned his name that I can disclose later on. But yeah, I'm very familiarized with his work.
I think actually, Rosalba, I first saw you together in a presentation, maybe here at Utrecht, or on decoloniality. I definitely have seen the pair of you in tandem, and heard Rolando talk about you as well. Frank, you had your hand up, but I feel we're all friends here. You don't really need to raise a hand.
Yes.
I've been raised as a very polite boy, so I can't really escape my past. So I was really intrigued by the distinction you make. I mean, it's a distinction I'm familiar with, but I have a hard time sort of grappling, particularly as an historian, sort of distinction between modernity, or so the linking of modernity and coloniality. Also because and I'm just wondering how, if you could sort of define that link a little bit more for me, in the sense that I, in my own work, so in the book that comes out in March next year, I talk about so I look at the 50s and 60s, and I look at how leaders in Africa developed their own modernization programs, and I talk about anti-colonial modernity, which, in my definition, is a modernity that is right, propagated by somebody like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, who puts forward this idea that that only by revaluing the African past, that then Africa can be modernized on Africa's terms, which is a complete reversal of the northern definition of modernity, which is technocratic, and the enemy of modernity is tradition in that definition, right? So I'm just wondering, is there a situation? Do you see a situation where modernity and decolonization can coexist, or I mean, is being anti-colonial and decolonial, does it necessarily mean that you have to be anti-modern, or is there a way where you can, or is there, you know, I'm just thinking about this analytically. Is it that coloniality and modernity always appear together, or can they appear separately?
Well, it's a very long question, comment. I'm thinking how to address it because there are so many elements on it. Well, basically, I'm following the way in which not only Walter Mignolo and others have been theorizing about it. When I think on the last part of what you say, is it possible to be, you mentioned, is it possible to think that decolonization can coexist with modernity? Well, it is. It is concretely, it has been the case. If you understand decolonization in the way in which you were giving us an example of the getting rid of former colonial powers from particular territories and construct a nation state, that happens to be the 1950s phenomenon. So yes, historically there, and I'm not an historian, but is there and it has coexisted. If that is our definition of decolonization, as connected with the constitution of a modern nation state. And I'm not an expert on anti-colonial thinking. I am learning slowly in conversations with not only students and researchers in ISS, but also with friends and colleagues based now in the continent, in Africa. And something that we are constantly thinking about, and I don't know if this is an answer, but this is where my thinking is right now, is on how to bring the anti-colonial amazing scholarship together with some of the scholarship emerging from so-called Latin America or Abyala, Latin America and the Caribbean, Abyala, in which the political horizon of that decolonization is not the constitution of the nation state, is not reproducing the logics of modernity, modernity coloniality. This is where my thinking, my praxis, my dialogues are in this moment, and I'm not claiming that this is something new or is something that I'm the only one doing it. It's something that, especially as feminists, anti-colonial and decolonial feminists, that we found extremely important. Also to revalue the contributions that many African anti-colonial thinkers were somehow offering at some point. But I'm not an expert at all, Frank. So this will be part of my answer. The second part of the answer that I want to bring here is that I think that something that for me is already a decolonial movement is actually present modernity as coloniality. Modernity as always co-constitute with coloniality, because it takes me analytically, but also conceptually, let's say, away from the possibility of rejecting binaries, and especially hierarchical binaries. By showing their co-constitution analytically and conceptually, then I feel much more free, but this is my decolonial feminism, much more free, much more liberated on thinking from the borders, thinking from concepts and categories that cannot be, contained just by the historical movement of modernity. I need both to actually speak from the borders, to actually speak from the colonial wound. And this is why I constantly and analytically insist in modernity as coloniality. And that is already a thinking, and this is the argument of Mignolo, but many others, this is already a decolonial way of thinking. And also brings the question of praxis. For me, it's really very rich as a feminist. Every time that I bring the question of coloniality as the underside of modernity, I then can critically explore the notion of gender and don't take it as a concept that is going to allow me to, let's say, diagnose everything that is grown not only with capitalism and development or capitalist development. No, there is something that the category of gender cannot allow me to speak of, to speak about, or to speak with others about. And that's why analytically and conceptually, for me, it makes sense not to disentangle modernity as coloniality. I hope that this makes sense.
Yeah, and I was just...
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, Rachel is frozen. I'll ask my question because I need to go and pick my son up. Yeah, Rosalba, nice to see you again.
Yes.
Yeah, it's been hard. Yes. Yeah. I was thinking. Yeah, I only took one class from you, sadly,
Yes.
on the general course at the ISS 12 years ago.
Perhaps the general course.
Yeah, it is the general course. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. The general course on theories and concepts of development. Now, Emmanuel, it's called the making of development. There was some improvement.
Yeah. I've heard the last time I came there last September. Yeah. So, oh yeah, and I'm hoping to come to your inaugural lecture. I have it in my diary somewhere, so that would be great. But I have a kind of thinking through almost the tension and contradictions that we face. So you talk about decoloniality as a new ethics and almost politics of knowledge creation. So on one hand, we're trying to find new ways of making knowledge, but you're based at the ISS. There are certain disciplinary measures of what knowledge and research looks like. And I found myself thinking, yeah, I would love to do that, but then I feel myself constrained in a sense that I do need a job. And if I do need a job, I do need to meet certain metrics of it, which are set up in the current way, and ways in which I might try to develop new sorts of knowledge takes longer. Like you're saying, you're building relationship that takes long. Just going there to extract and write it up. So how do we balance that tension that doing the decolonial work entails? And like you said, yeah, there is a bit of pain, but should it be the older people to do that? So the younger ones can be established. So how do you deal with that tension?
Well, first, thank you, Emmanuel. It's so nice to see you again, and I will be very happy to host you again at some point at ISS. Look, first of all, yeah, we alone. This is why coalitions or a feminism that is constantly thinking and forging coalitions is so important within academia. But also, that's what I was bringing the question of the horizons. Which are the horizons within the academic work that we are doing? Is these horizons for reproducing the same kind of validation mechanisms, or is this something else that we are thinking about? Let me give you an example. Some years ago, one of the PhDs that was that used to work under my supervision, now she has graduated, was actually asked in her PhD seminar, who was actually a praxis of decoloniality with First Nation midwives, and how she was unlearning also her colonial subjectivity in sharing with them practices of healing. I cannot say more because the argument hasn't been, let's say, published. So she's about to publish it. So let's say that it was a very interesting example of the colonial practice. And one of the main considerations of the people who was evaluating her was, please tell us, how should we validate your work? And I found that really interesting, because although it was not, from my point of view, her responsibility, because she was a young member of academia, just finalizing her PhD, this really sedimented in a cohort of young PhD researchers at ISS and postdocs at ISS who are really seriously taking that question into consideration. There is a recent graduate from ISS that I quote in my presentation today, Suleika Sheikh, whose PhD is proposing precisely not only a politics of knowledge in the field of development studies, but in general in critical social sciences, but that came up with an approach to knowledge that she refuses from a refusing perspective of Tock and Yang, refusing research, that is called liminography. And this liminography is what she calls a practice for communal liberation. The horizon is liberation from modern selfhood, but also modern aspirations of recognition by institutions. And she manages to, for example, in this particular proposal of liminography, to come up with very interesting, let's say, presentation of her findings, although these are not findings, and she will kill me if I say findings, but on the learnings and the lessons that she arrived to doing research with women of color in academia in the Netherlands. And one of them took the form of podcasts. And she got a cum laude. And I'm saying this because the panel of evaluators in this PhD were actually very happy to see that they will be challenged to validate forms of knowledge that are not individual, but more and more collective, collaborative, and that are not necessarily only speaking in colonial languages, including English, because she brings a lot of non-colonial languages to express. Part of the dissertation is also very much written in a poetic form. And in this example, what I'm trying to say is that the new work that is coming out is taken very seriously, that there are proposals there to actually the link from traditional ways of validation in academia. But this has not been done alone. She has not been doing this work alone, and she recognized that since the first page of her PhD. And it leaves behind a coalition of women of color and people of color in the Netherlands, trying to redefine the link from, let's say, forms of validation that hierarchically put places first English, individual work, extraction that accepts the horizon of validation as what is scientifically intelligible in the critical social sciences. So it gives me hope. It doesn't resolve the tension. It gives me hope. And I really invite you to give a look to her work because it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And this is one of a couple of others that are coming, not just from ISS, but from other decolonial feminists now in academia. I don't know if it in part answers your question. The other part is what I mentioned at the beginning. Of course, we have to pay our bills and feed our families and our business is publications and all of that. So one intermediate solution that I found, but again, is not me, is a coalition of scholars of color around the global North-South, and is the constitution of an autonomous non-commercial publishing house called Retos, the National Network of the Knowledge's Publishing House. And perhaps you might say, well, yeah, there are a lot of autonomous publishing houses. But in our case, and this comes from collaborative work with First Nations back in the south of Mexico, we all, all the people involved in the establishment of this autonomous publishing house, we learn the whole activity of publishing a book. So there were not this assumed idea that some will be doing the thinking and others will be doing the editing and someone else will be doing the technical montage. No, we all learn how to do it. We all learn what we are not supposed to know because we are intellectuals doing important things. On the contrary, we learn what a book entails. And not only that, we create the conditions economically, materially, for those who have no permanent positions, have no salaries, to actually come and learn with us what does it mean to create a book. And in this case, this means donating your salary, especially those of us who work and live in the global north, or donating time if you cannot donate your salary. And we also create a network of translators because many of our contributors are people who don't speak English and don't want to learn English. So we are translating their work from non-indigenous languages into Spanish or into English or wherever is needed in that moment. So it's not me alone. It's a network that has to take me like 20 years to be part of. I'm not the only one. I'm not the founder. But I value this kind of activities, always with the horizon of autonomy and always with the horizon of stealing time from the capitalist time, stealing resources from the capitalist university, the neoliberal university, as much as this is possible, given the parameters of the work I do. I don't know if this answers your question.
I think it's a wonderful example of a mode of being. Am I frozen?
Yes, you are. Yeah, no, that's good, Rosalba. Yeah, I appreciate that. It
Thank you for the question, Emmanuel, but it's of course not easy. It's not easy, and it requires a lot of time. And one of my dear friends, Aminata Cairo, constantly say that, yeah, it requires a lot of sacrifices. I personally decided at some point to stop publishing in Journals A, because I didn't have the interest anymore, and I found it more consistent with the collaborative ethics, because most of the time, as you know, in the field of development studies, it's very difficult for the people we are supposed to be writing for and servicing with our research to access or even understand what we are trying to share in publications as listed as A. But that is me. Other colleagues are, for example, pushing for new ways of validating what is supposed to be relevant science in the field of development studies and how the metrics continue to be something relevant. I have seen in all these years how, for example, being able to present your narrative in some institutions that grant money is becoming much more important. But of course, is against the grain of normalcy. It's against the grain of what is expected from you. It's not an easy task. That's why you need coalitions everywhere.
I'm going to try and be unfrozen, fluid, I guess, alive. and say thank you, Rosalba. Also, as I said, for this inspiration about a mode of being, and for the affirmation that it is hard to balance these things, and that it requires finding a balance and making some hard decisions. And I think that's also good and also inspirational as we move forward in our decolonial work and praxis. I've frozen
Thank
again.
you, Rachel.
And I know we have 5 minutes, and some of us are picking up children, and that's an acknowledgement of life-work balance. And collaborative, also finding funding within modes that are recognized within the neoliberal model, but then disseminating it to other peoples and places that need it is a thing that helps as well. But most of all, thank you, Rosalba, for your time, freely given and gratefully received. Thank you, everybody, for coming in solidarity and community with us and sharing learning. And we will see you at the next one. Some of you, and some of you in all of our gatherings together, hopefully in person at some undetermined time in the future. Thank you for being present, not just here, but present. And peace out.
Yeah,
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone, for listening so patiently. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah, you too.
So all.
Later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. How does this stop?